recognize some faces from the last time we met, where we went over the history of resistance medicine and a little bit into herbalism for activism. So I'm just going to do a super brief introduction. We are an anarcho-socialist witchcraft collective and seminary. No, you don't have to be a witch to make use of any of our content. If you do follow us anywhere where we put out our content, some of it will be dedicated to witchcraft and some of it will be dedicated to activism, because we believe that witchcraft is inherently political. You can make use of any and all of our content that suits you. You're welcome to share it with people who are not witches. No requirements to believe in witchcraft to make use of anything we put out. I am the primary instructor for this course. We have other instructors that teach other courses, including Yen here, who's going to be running our slides. And this course will continue for as long as Ruma lets us, covering a variety of practical, applied, hands-on things for both street medicine, action medicine, protest medicine, riot medicine, and herbalism to support such. So I think next week we are getting into sun and heat treatment. Week after that we're getting into dealing with abrasions. Week after that we're getting into how to prepare yourself for going and mucking out after a flood. So give you an idea of the range of topics we'll be covering. But today we are starting with ethics, because I don't teach this class without getting into ethics first. This has been an ongoing point of contention with other medics, where they're like, you should get into practical stuff later and you can always come back to ethics. No, you can't. There's a reason why if you go into certain medical programs, they will introduce you to ethics as one of your first classes. So if you need to leave at any time, that's fine. The video will be available on YouTube, on Patreon. You can message me and get a copy of it. You can message Ruma and I'm sure they'll get you a copy of it. If you want to follow along with us, if it helps you, the full transcript of everything that I'm about to say is available through a QR code right there. That is the notes for this presentation. They also already went out as a PDF on our Patreon. But that enables you, if you want to follow along on a phone, on a laptop, on a tablet, whatever, to do so. I know that some people have a little bit of problem following along with slides and verbal stuff if they can't read it, so there it is. Okay, before I get started, I can answer questions during, but try to keep them brief, and there will be a question and answer session at the end.
Also, we are booked until 8:30.
Oh, cool. So we have plenty of time to get through my 27 pages of notes. I'll just talk really fast. Go ahead. Okay. In 2001, medics held their first national conference in Athens, Ohio. I mentioned this during the history last week. At this meeting, the Athens Manifesto was created. The manifesto's primary focus was on how to coordinate between medic organizations when they must work together at larger events. In 2010, medic collectives and individual medics convened for a second time nationally in Ohio. Amongst other topics, they reviewed the Athens Manifesto, and some changes in language were made that modified the manifesto to provide more concrete procedures for resolving disputes, methods for verifying references, and to emphasize collective and individual responsibilities, including in resolving differences. The updated version of the manifesto was not, unfortunately, widely distributed. I have not been able to source a copy. I've never met anyone who could source a copy for me. If you ever come across a copy of it, please get it to me. It's very frustrating. So unfortunately, we have the older one here to get you started with. If you work with other collectives of street medics, they will expect you to have known this, been taught this at some point. This is kind of the standard ethical presentation. So, proposal. We must establish protocols on dealing with each other. Below are first steps and suggestions rising out of the medics gathering held in Athens in August of 2001. We will do facilitation and anti-oppression work in the trainings. Oppressive behavior has happened in trainings and on the streets and in the clinics coming from action medical and first aid people. We want to prevent it from happening again. You can be a neurosurgeon or the most experienced trainer around, but if you don't know how to facilitate or are oppressive in your behavior, you are doing more harm than good. We must work to actively involve local activists and medics in decision-making roles. Direction must come from local collectives or organizations. Rights. We have the right to work in a clinic or street situation that is non-oppressive. We have the right to confront individuals and or groups we believe are acting in an oppressive manner without ridicule or being ostracized. All disciplines, Herbalists, witches, allopathic, homeopathic, naturopathic, etc. must be honored and respected. We have the right to respectfully disagree. We have the right to verify one's references and ask anyone we feel uncomfortable working with to leave. We have a right to a safe place that is not the clinic. Responsibilities. It is the responsibility of every individual to stand up for their own beliefs. It is everyone's responsibility to deal with your own shit and not bring that shit to actions. We have the responsibility to help keep all parts of the rising global movement on the streets and growing in a healthy way. We have the responsibility to speak out if we see, hear, or feel something we do not like, specifically things that create an insecure or sketchy environment. It is our responsibility to develop the tools to get our shit together in order that we can do the job as medics and first aid people that we have taken on. It is our responsibility to work with, not over, the local activists and know that we have permission or have been asked for help before taking on tasks. It is our responsibility to publicize our existence more effectively. Proposals. Each community, affinity group, and collective needs to face their own internal oppressive issues and work to prevent those issues from impacting the larger action. We are going to disagree. When we do, it is our recommendation that mediation be more actively used. Every community, affinity group, collective should develop those mediation skills or have access to those who do. Medic teams should each rotate through security at the door of the clinic. Our needs for triage and security mean that we are the only ones capable of doing this. We must explore decentralization of the medics, e.g. a clinic team responsible for the clinic, affinity groups being responsible for their own housing and supplies, separate safe spaces, all with increased coordination for logistical needs and ensuring that shifts are filled. A backup clinic and set of supplies should exist for every major action. Location and decision to use these should be on a need-to-know basis among folks trusted by all sectors of the movement. Medics should use the spokes council model in order to have daily meetings and streamline those meetings. This is the older version. As I said, I haven't found the newer version anywhere to download it and make it available to you. If I ever do, this will get updated. This is the standard model for operating ethically. And then if you were, for example, to download any of the PDFs of the street medic guides that have been put out by like the Colorado Street Medics, Hakan Geigers, Riot Medicine, absolutely phenomenal, highly recommended to everyone. I will make it available in the crisis preparedness section on our Patreon as a free thing for you to download. It will get into the following. These are the following ethical principles that are going to pop up in basically every street medic guide that you were to download and read for yourself. And I do recommend you download as many of those as you can and read as many as you can. Principles of street medicine as agreed on by most collectives. The following ethics most, not everyone, agrees to. Do no harm. I fundamentally disagree with this one. I'm just gonna lay it out right now that this is not what I ask my medics and my collective to sign on to. I ask that you agree with do the least harm. I am not a pacifist. I am aware many medics are, and if you make that personal choice to be pacifistic, I will support you. I do not require that medics I work to say that they will do the least harm. If you want to swear that you're going to do no harm, that's great, you do that. I'm not. Okay, that's my boundary for myself, and I don't require it of others. I will agree that a street action, riot, protest, medic must not contribute to harm by being careless, by being misinformed, by acting outside their ability, or refusing to help those that they have pledged to help. There is some debate as to whether or not street action, riot, protest, medics, etc. are neutral. If a medic is acting in a neutral capacity, then do no harm extends to not acting to harm those on the other side. And by extension, they tend to interpret that as meaning that you will help them in a medic capacity as needed. And this is where we got into last time that we met, my explanation of what a black medic is, which is what I would be called. I just don't really like using black as a pejorative thing. What it means, I don't help Nazis. Full stop. I won't. I will not help a Proud Boy. I will not waste my supplies. I will not waste my training. If they are endangering themselves during their actions, that's on them. They should have their own medics. That they don't tend to have medics, they tend to rely on ours. I won't stop you. Let's say that we're out at a protest together and you want to go help the Proud Boy, by all means. That's up to you. But I will not. Therefore, I don't pledge to do no harm because my inaction is doing harm to that person, but I will try to do the least harm. Now, I personally could get into an ethical debate with all of you, where I'd say that helping a Nazi is doing harm, but that's beyond the scope of this class, so let's move on. Second principle, spread calm. A medic has an obligation to remain calm and to spread calm when in service at an action, protest, riot, or emergency situation. In crisis, people tend to mirror the emotions of those around them. Medics must provide a good mirror. Spreading calm does not mean trying to keep the peace or control other people's actions. It does not mean preventing a riot or stopping property damage from taking place. This might look like saying loudly, walk, don't run, as things are starting to escalate and people are starting to panic and run. It may look like walking calmly yourself when you're starting to want to speed up and run. Although I've seen medics insist that spreading calm means it is a part of a medic's duties to prevent violence, it isn't. No more than it is part of a medic's duties on a battlefield to prevent bloodshed on that battlefield. Being a medic also does not grant a person an intrinsic moral high ground. It is not our job to police the actions of protesters or rioters, only to assist them in surviving what they choose to do. However, we can encourage calm by careful phrasing such as, let's walk over here, instead of run, and sometimes it's appropriate to speak with urgent command. However, it is never appropriate to speak in panic. Don't contribute to the panic. Next principle, do not create a second patient. It is part of a medic's responsibility not to cause another person to become injured by keeping them in a dangerous place, by using them as a shield, or by refusing to retreat with that patient, etc. Additionally, they should endeavor not to become in need of a medic's assistance themselves. For example, walking into tear gas without a gas mask on to pull someone out and then being in need of medical attention yourself, then that just means that more people need care and more supplies get used, and now you're benched. You can't keep helping. So just like in an airplane situation where they say put your own mask on first, then go help other people, don't create a second patient doesn't just mean don't injure someone else accidentally, it means don't injure yourself either. Yes, I have been injured at protests. So far I've never been injured at a protest where I was a medic. I've been injured at a protest where I was a part of the Black Bloc, and I've been injured at a protest where I was the person up front in the costume. Got hit in the head with an American flag. Work within your scope. This is part of the legal requirements for being considered a Good Samaritan, which is the legal auspices under which medics operate, as we will explore as we get into the legalities sections. Additionally, it is an ethical requirement. A medic and or the herbalist supporting them must work within the scope of their own training, their capabilities, their certifications, their licensing, etc. Know what to do when you don't know what to do. In cases where a patient presents with extreme or confusing symptoms, it can be overwhelming or make you as a medic feel inadequate or insufficient. Take the time to respond slowly and methodically, rather than allowing the intensity of a situation to pressure you into speeding up, panicking, or to trigger your own fight or flight response. While there are some situations where a quick response is necessary, most of the time, hasty and panicked responses will be incorrect. Remember that even if it is an emergency, you as the medic are not the one experiencing the emergency. It is fine to know that a patient is in pain and to want to help them as quickly as you can. It is not fine to internalize that panic and the pain of your patient, particularly when that will get in the way of allowing you to help them more effectively. Follow the assessment system with all due deliberation, provide whatever aid you can within the scope of your practice, and be willing to refer out when necessary. Tagging in a more experienced medic is fine. That's great. Okay. This is where most street medic handbooks will stop. They will say, that's it, that's the ethics. You've got the Athens Manifesto, and you've got those principles, and you're good. I don't do that. So this is where Yun teases me a little bit about being overly thorough. This is my overly thorough version of the ethics, except that I have personally encountered every single thing that went on this list. So is it overly thorough if it's been necessary to point it out to people? Anyway, although I am also an action, street, protest, and riot medic, I'm also an herbalist, and I've had this argument extensively within the herbalism community as well. There needs to be a larger, more agreed upon ethical standard that does not just apply to the medic community or the herbalist community. Misinformation is rampant right now. I have never seen it this bad in my entire life, and it's getting worse. Anti-intellectualism is hugely common. There is an overarching proud culture of ignorance and bullying. Empathy and education are both being scorned. We may not be able to fix this as an overarching umbrella of cultural problems, but we can address it within our own personal practice and the sphere of our influence. Many people who work in healthcare will be familiar with the theoretical framework for the ethics of their profession that is based on the 4 ethical principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. Many people who work as licensed allopathic healthcare providers or as unlicensed naturopathic providers will recognize these as the requirements to do good, avoid doing harm, respect the right of individuals to make decisions for themselves, and ensure that people are treated fairly. This framework, often referred to as principalism, has been the standard of ethics since first introduced by American scholars Beauchamp and Childress decades ago. However, this isn't the standard of ethics that I feel we should abide by. It's a starting point. Principalism has received criticism for being an incomplete framework and not being readily applicable across different cultures. As an example, the American ideology of autonomy is very different from some cultures' ideas about autonomy. Another criticism of principalism is that it takes a rather formulaic approach to ethics that focuses on the application of processes rather than upon being ethical, choosing every day to do good things, rather than to sit back and say, oh, well, I followed the rules, I'm a good person. It does not take into account the virtue or the intentions of the person who is acting. I instead follow a framework that has emerged from the work of a global consortium of researchers, academics, research participants, policymakers, and research ethic committee leads, together with representatives from funding bodies and the pharmaceutical industry. Their framework uses a base of care, respect, honesty, and fairness. These values are not perfectly cross-cultural, but these particular values have been found to have a large degree of cross-cultural agreement. The values framework was originally developed for application in research collaborations and has been used to develop multiple codes of conduct for research, but the 4 values can provide a foundation for analysis of ethics across many disciplines and many scenarios. Like other researchers and practitioners, I have expanded and altered that framework to suit both my practice as an herbalist and my practice as an Action Street protest or riot medic. Care. For both a medic and someone who practices the herbalism side of that, it is a demonstration of concern. Basically, give a fuck. Just care. It's a concern for the well-being of those whom we assist, as well as their communities and the environments that those communities exist in. For practitioners of both herbal medicine and the action medicine part of things, care is making sure to have knowledge and expertise, to apply them well, and to give a damn about the long-term effects of our assistance. Practitioners must make judgment calls about what is indicated in any given situation, about what is safer, and make that in a risk-aware fashion. Not just risk-aware about the consequences of the moment, but the consequences reaching forward into the future. A crucial component of this is a commitment to lifelong learning, which we will explore in more depth. Care is also demonstrated and required with informed consent. A medic must not touch someone without asking, a medic must wait for permission to receive, and they must not violate a person's autonomy. Additionally, care is shown when practitioners work only within the bounds of their scope and their competence. Care is shown when medics and herbalists only use products from trusted suppliers in order to ensure quality and ethical sourcing methods. Another example of care should be demonstrated in the way medics and herbalists communicate with those who they are assisting. For instance, the provision of written information to someone who cannot hear you would be a kind of care. For producers of herbal medicine, care also demands that we avoid doing harm to our local communities. Care is shown when the herbalist takes care to produce products that are of reliable quality and free from contamination. As with all of these, there are challenges when acting with care. It may require more time, more effort, better resources, and easy access to appropriate information. Paywalls make care harder. I highly encourage piracy. So, respect. Medics and herbalists both will be called upon to assist people whose customs, cultures, traditions, spiritual paths, religions, and personal preferences may be significantly different from their own. They will also be called upon to assist people in ways that they would just not select for themselves. Some of a medic or herbalist's responsibilities involve cultural competency training and sensitivity training. We must not insult those whom we are assisting, and we absolutely must not violate their choices, their right to make their own choices. Sometimes this means not taking off a headscarf or using unfamiliar neopronouns. Sometimes this means not providing a person with an alcohol-based tincture due to cultural or religious prohibitions, against alcohol. Sometimes this means fetching a medic of another gender because the person who is being assisted cannot be touched by a person of a different gender than their own. In cultures with an established tradition of herbal medicine, some treatments may be considered more valuable or more significant in ways that are not obvious to outsiders. Additionally, consent from other individuals beyond the proximate patient may be a cultural imperative before treatment can be administered. Respect cultural differences and preferences, should they arise. Ultimately, a medic or herbalist cannot compel an informed patient or client to make any particular decision for their treatment or their health. Honesty. Don't lie is a fairly fundamental value cross-culturally. In the medic and herbalist communities, honesty is a broader requirement than that. Although deliberately deceiving a person is kind of obvious wrongdoing, it is also equally unacceptable to omit important information. It is extremely unethical to steer a person's decisions regarding their care by only presenting part of the information. Medics and herbalists must provide their clients, potential clients, students, and those they assist with truthful, non-misleading information about their experience, their training, their services, their practices. If they are not a licensed physician, they must never, ever present themselves as one. All medics and herbalists should be honest and open about the type of evidence that is available for the treatments that they are suggesting in terms of efficacy and the potential for adverse effects. If a medic or an herbalist has a gap in their knowledge and they don't know what they're doing, that needs to be revealed to the person they're assisting. For herbal practitioners, honesty also requires being aware and honest when evidence stems purely from traditional usage, anecdotal observation, and/or if it actually has some scientific investigation to back it up. Honesty also requires the correct labeling of all herbal products and not lying about what they are capable of doing. I cannot tell you the misleading claims I've seen on herbal products. How often I've seen something claim to cure or treat something it absolutely cannot. This is complicated. In a riot or protest environment or in an emergency, oftentimes there's not a lot of time for chatting. However, one should endeavor to be clear, concise, honest, and open, even in a limited amount of time. Don't lie to someone, even if it would make things faster for you. Maybe especially if you think that it would just smooth things over if you lied a little bit. Not a great time. Fairness. Fairness is equitable, impartial, and just treatment or behavior without favoritism or discrimination. This does not mean treating all people equally, but rather each in accordance with their own needs, equitably, with an eye towards justice. As medics and herbalists, we are ethically responsible for promoting and fostering fairness and justice. We must respect the uniqueness and intrinsic worth of every individual. We must be committed to fostering a trusting environment free of harassment, intimidation, and discrimination. We must strive to ensure an environment of inclusiveness and a commitment to fairness, justice, and diversity, and advocate for policies and procedures that foster fair, consistent, and equitable treatment for everyone that you choose to treat. For a medic and an herbalist, that involves fairness in distribution, corrective fairness or justice, and fairness in exchange. Fairness in distribution means the quality of treatment should be available to all, regardless of any prejudicial factors, and that each should be given what they need. So often, care, medical or otherwise, is out of reach for marginalized and oppressed populations. Medics and herbal practitioners may not be able to fix this inequity and injustice on a larger scale, but they can fight for fairness on a local level. Corrective fairness proposes the availability of mechanisms to right a wrong and includes considerations such as liability and accountability. Fairness in exchange generally means that each person gets the important things that they need and gives up some of the less important things that they could do without. For the herbalist creating the remedies that a medic uses, this may mean asking only for the cost of materials and not charging retail for the remedies that they produce for their medics, and the medic not expecting the herbalist to take on the financial burden of creating the remedies on top of the time and effort of creating them. This would be a fair exchange between an herbalist and a medic that they are supporting. Fairness would also require reasonable recompense for the community where the materials and herbs are sourced. Okay. Additions. I will acknowledge that if taken to their logical full extension, the principles of care, respect, honesty, and fairness would cover all of the additions I've made. They all slot into what I just rattled off to you. But I make some, Young referred to these ones as stressed clarifications. If you ever want to just sit down with me and chat, I will tell you the stories behind each of these and why I stress them so firmly, but we don't have time for that tonight. So, be informed and educated. This would be part of give a fuck. Care about what you're doing, but let's get into it in a little bit more depth. Although plant-based herbal medications have been in use by cultures around the world since prehistoric times, and globally an estimated 70,000 species of plants are used for medicinal purposes, that doesn't make them all perfectly safe. Even ancient medical records demonstrate that there was an understanding of contraindications, dosage concerns, and the risk of poisonings associated with making use of herbal remedies. There are a number of potential risks associated with the use of herbal medications that have been researched and documented and observed through the historical records all the way to modern times. Only a tiny fraction of the known herbal medicines have been subjected to rigorous scientific testing under controlled conditions, and the available clinical studies of herbal medicines vary greatly in their thoroughness, their quality, and their usefulness to any herbal practitioner. Additionally, an Action Street protest or riot medic makes use of allopathic or non-herb-based medicines. Although legally medics are not protected by Good Samaritan laws as soon as we give an over-the-counter medication to a person, such as an aspirin or an ibuprofen, the techniques we use to help others are still considered part of a non-naturopathic framework. Many of the techniques used by the medics are considered part of the allopathic medical framework, even though they do not involve allopathic pharmaceuticals. The modern definition of allopathic medicine, it should be noted, is relatively new. As we covered last time in the history, so I'm only going to get into it really briefly, the grandmother figure, who was good at taking care of the people of the village who practiced herbal medicine, would, if competent, have been able to do everything an action or street medic is trained to do if the technology existed at that time. So although they are part of an allopathic medicine, according to the modern framework and historic sense, that line was a lot blurrier. In the 13th and 14th century, a new structure to medieval medical practice with tiers was established. On the top tier were the physicians, physici or medici, who were university educated. The second tier was medical professionals associated with monasteries, the infirmari, who studied medicine, although not always from the universities. Below them were the surgeons, whose ability and renown depended on the university they had attended, and if they'd actually attended university. Below that tier were the apothecaries, and below that tier were barbers, who often performed surgical and medical tasks like bloodletting and teeth pulling. But by the 14th century, it was common to refer to traditional healers, midwives, and herbalists as rustics, or as old women, vetulae, very pejoratively. It was a term used to describe bad women, including sex workers, fortune tellers, barbers, converted Jews, and midwives. Shortly thereafter, midwifery healing performed by AFAB and femme-presenting healers was often labeled witchcraft, and those who performed it were persecuted as witches. This got gone into a lot more detail earlier. Yes, I see a question.
No, I'm pointing. You're blocking the corner.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were trying to flag me someone was asking a question. The differentiation between kinds of medicine is all really relative and based on current cultural norms and mores. The formation of the AMA was explicitly to take power from the hands of black people and women and to take money from the hands of black people and women. And the medical system has never been friendly to the marginalized and the oppressed. But that's not why we use herbal medicines. Herbal medicine, otherwise known as phytotherapy, involves the use of portions of plants, including but not limited to seeds, berries, roots, leaves, and barks, and the preparations thereof for medicinal purposes. The extent to which herbal medicine is accepted, both legally and culturally, varies dramatically around the world. The World Health Organization classifies a healthcare intervention based on the local tradition and culture as traditional medicine, whereas that same intervention, displaced either culturally or geographically, is now considered complementary medicine. Therefore, in most industrialized countries, herbal medicines utilized by colonial societies are typically considered complementary rather than traditional. In colonized nations or cultures, there are often extensive cultural herbal traditions based on locally available plants, which are referred to as traditional. Herbal medical traditions contribute substantially to most so-called ethnomedicines, which are medical systems developed by indigenous cultures, First Nations cultures, typically with a deep entwinement with the cultural context of their culture of origin. Often, these so-called ethnomedicines incorporate a range of therapeutic interventions and are recognized by the rest of the world as holistic systems of care. Traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine are two of the best-known examples of an ethnomedical tradition that is a full system of care, where herbalism and what we would consider or allopathic interventions medically are intertwined with each other, not separated the way that they are here. Most Western colonial societies consider herbalism as a discrete approach, and they treat it as a complementary, separate therapy. And you would use it either as in complementary medicine or an alternative medicine to allopathic care. According to a market analysis by Fortune Business Insights, the global market for herbal medicine was valued at 233 billion USD in 2024, and it's projected to grow to 251.25 billion USD in 2025 and 437 billion USD by 2032. Potential reasons for this growth include the desire for more natural systems of medicine, the desire to avoid the side effects of allopathic treatments, treatments for general wellness, and a lack of access, financial or otherwise, to care from an allopathic physician. Additionally, herbal medicines are used to contribute to allopathic treatments, with many as 1/2 of all pharmaceutical drugs being derived from plants. Any of you ever taken an aspirin? That's derived from plants. That is based on a phytochemical that was extracted originally from white willow bark. Okay? It was extracted from white willow bark because the First Nations people were observed using white willow bark to treat pain and fevers. This is 50% of our pharmaceutical industry is based on plant chemicals, phytochemicals, things extracted from plants. Eventually they figure out how to synthesize them, how to create the chemical without the plant stuff sometimes. I mean, like, atropine is still extracted from plants. But we use herbal medicines because often it's all we're legally allowed to use. We use herbal medicines because often it's what we can access. We use herbal medicines because often it's what we can afford. And all of this brings me to my point about being educated and informed. Because natural does not mean safe. A significant number of people hold the mistaken assumption that herbal products are safe because they are natural. This is just flat out untrue. Herbal medicines have pharmacological effects just like synthetic pharmaceuticals. They are all drugs. They are all drugs. Many plants are potentially toxic or deadly, and there is typically far less safety data available for herbal products than is required for conventional medicines. Herbal medicines can be associated with adverse drug reactions, including overdose, toxicity, drug interactions, allergic reactions, or contamination with other products. Most herbal medicines are not taken through the phases of development that are required for pharmaceuticals before being released into the open market. Sometimes they have been in use for hundreds or thousands of years, so we have a lot of evidence for how they're used and records of the risks, the dosages, the potential side effects, but that doesn't mean that we always fully understand what is occurring in a person's body when they make use of that. This means that we don't always know what drug interactions will occur or all the possible contraindications that a person will have. Even the herbal medicines that have been relatively well studied may only have been tested on certain groups of people. For example, they may not have been tested on pregnant people. They may not have been tested on children or lactating people, the elderly, or people with multiple comorbidities. This is also true for many allopathic pharmaceuticals in the testing process. Most medication has been tested specifically on cis people who don't smoke, don't drink, and don't have complicating comorbidities. Most drugs are tested on that. And this is an ongoing problem. I don't remember exactly what year it was that they started requiring the AFAB people go through drug testing too. But they didn't always. Anyway. Because most herbal medicine's potential for harm is largely unknown, people tend to assume that it just doesn't exist. Unfortunately, natural does not necessarily mean better or safer. Everything is poisonous under the right or wrong conditions, in the wrong dosage, or when combined with the wrong thing. You can die from drinking too much water, okay? Everything has a lethal dose. This has a direct impact on the ability to give informed consent to treatment. An herbalist cannot always provide information about efficacy, contraindications, or side effects. You have to inform people about risks and benefits to the best of your ability to do so, acknowledging the limitations in your research. It is the responsibility of all medics to have at least a thorough and well-informed understanding of the protocols, the first aid, etc. that are part of a medic's job. If they intend to be an herbalist as well, rather than working with an herbalist, that too requires an enormous amount of study and preparedness. For both of these, the study is constant. You are never done learning. Research that is ongoing on herbal medicines can and will provide additional information that will inform patient care in a clinical setting, and should ideally be done with an eye towards filling existing gaps in your knowledge. However, it would be equally unethical and unrealistic to restrict the use of Action Street protest riot medicine and plant-based medicines to only those methods that have been tested robustly, as this would deny access to medicine for entire communities, particularly in resource-poor areas. Nevertheless, given the aforementioned ethical challenge for the provision of Action Street protest and riot medicine and herbal medicine, it is vital that we put some measure of responsibility on the practitioner to try and prioritize well-studied and well-verified methodologies. For the allopathic end of things, the protocols are constantly being updated. What was considered best practice a year ago may no longer be best practice now. For example, milk of Maalox is no longer recommended as a treatment for tear gas exposure. Rubbing alcohol is no longer recommended as a treatment for cuts. As a kid, did your parents ever pour hydrogen peroxide on your cuts? That is not recommended. That has been clinically demonstrated to do more harm than good. It works as a debriding solution, but it's really best used just to get blood out of your clothing after you've helped someone. It doesn't belong in your kit as a treatment for cuts and abrasions, but you'll see people carry it anyway because they're not updating their knowledge as things are corrected. Environmental impact and commitment. Research is needed to ensure that herbs are ethically sourced in such a way that harm is not caused during the growing, harvesting, or potentially the manufacturing of herbal products. This includes the impact upon the local communities as well as the environment in which the plants are grown. This includes not purchasing over-harvested plants, plants that are being cultivated in a way that is detrimental to the region in which they are grown, or plants where cultivation or harvesting is culturally damaging to the people who are living in that area. Additionally, be aware of the increase in biopiracy, where traditional herbal medicines are patented without the consent of the cultures of origination, much less any compensation being provided to them. It is the responsibility of herbal practitioners to have some awareness of the geographic and cultural origins of the herbs that they use in their practice. Herbalists should not utilize herbs or herbal products that are derived from any wild species known to be threatened or endangered. It is the duty of all herbalists to remain cognizant about those herbs that are endangered and threatened and adopt appropriate practices in the harvesting and use of those herbs. Herbalists also have a responsibility to train the next generation of herbalists not to promote the use of wildcrafted herbs whose survival is threatened or endangered. Be responsible, keep informed. When collecting and harvesting plants, please be responsible and avoid endangered species. By the same token, when buying herbs and botanicals, please check your suppliers for ethical conduct. Herbs are a big money business. We just covered how many billions they are worth to people. And unfortunately, this is a prime consideration for pickers and wholesalers. Buy ethically sourced, fair trade, and non-endangered herbs whenever possible. Buy from local people who wildcraft responsibly. Try to avoid endangered species. Medics who choose not to be herbalists themselves should still endeavor to work with an environmentally responsible herbalist for the products that they use in their kit. Conflict of interest. It is vital for all medics and herbalists to acknowledge when and where they have a conflict of interest and to know how this is going to affect the performance of their duties. Ethical leadership. Medics and herbal practitioners at all levels should question individual and group actions when necessary to ensure that decisions are ethical and are implemented as such. Leadership should be selected by the group that they are going to represent, not assigned to the group that they're going to represent. Sexual harassment, abuse, and discrimination. Medics and herbalists must never use their positions as teachers, mentors, consultants, or leaders to seek sexual encounters or make unwanted sexual advances with students, clients, or other medics and herbalists. Additionally, abuse, discrimination, and bullying of any kind are unacceptable and should not be tolerated. Be accountable. Part of operating as an ethical medic or herbalist is understanding when you are acting in a marginalizing and repressive fashion and attempting to check it or fix it. A medic must take complaints about their behavior or the care they provide very seriously. We have to be accountable somehow to the community that we are serving. Peer review. Medics and herbalists must welcome a peer review of what they teach, what they make, why and how they make it, the protocols they are using, etc. I have been corrected on things. That's good. I will not know everything. I will make mistakes. I am a person. I have flaws. I have blind spots. I have biases. And it helps if we are checking each other on our information. Referrals. Medics and herbalists should encourage clients to exercise their right to see other practitioners. Medics and herbalists must recognize their own limitations of practice. When they believe a condition is beyond their scope of expertise as a medic or an herbalist, or when it is clear that someone is not satisfied with the care that they are providing them, they must encourage clients to seek further support from other qualified professionals. Avoiding needless assistance. The primary determining factor for recommending any course of action to a client as a medic must be the specific needs of that client at that time. It should ideally be informed by factors such as the history of that client, as well as the feasibility of any given course of action, but unnecessary supplemental recommendations should be avoided. You acting as a medic for someone is not a great time to try and point them towards your herbalism side business. It is not a great time to recommend 15 other products and try and sell a bunch of your stuff to them. Avoid needless assistance. Focus on the exact thing that they're asking for help or anything that is actually adjacent to that issue. Okay. Humanitarian service. Medics must not ever be financially compensated for their services. This is just flat out. This is both legal and ethical. You cannot accept payment as a medic. Now, if people want to throw money in a hat to chip in for medic supplies, we can do that. But if you are out at a protest and somebody's like, let me pay you, no, you cannot accept that. Herbalists must be willing to attend to those in need of help without making monetary compensation for primary consideration. I'm not saying an herbalist can't be paid for their work. I'm saying that finances shouldn't be the primary reason you're an herbalist. Quality materials. You have an obligation to work in good faith to source and use materials that are formulated and manufactured in a way that will deliver the desired results, striving to obtain organically and sustainably grown and ethically harvested botanicals whenever possible. But really the point I should have stressed here, so many herbal products grow mold. I'm not entirely sure what's going on in the herbalist community where they don't know how to source propylene glycol and use it appropriately. But you can put preservatives in your natural products, and if you're not putting preservatives in your natural products, they need to be tossed at a certain point because they're no longer good, and I see a lot of that not happening. Okay, education and mentoring. Do Riot and street medics have an obligation to educate others? This is an ethical debate in the community. I know where I stand, but much of the work of street medics is reactive. We respond to the needs of protesters primarily, but also the unhoused, people in urgent climate crisis, etc. At the same time, the street medic movement is just as much about education as it is about post hoc patching up and eye-washing for protesters. This is glossed over in the Medic Wikia overview of Do No Harm and its emphasis on prevention as a form of care. Education to those attending the action, the protest, the riot, the emergency, etc. It is the responsibility of the medics associated with the protest to brief the protesters on basic safety procedures and preparation. I know that sometimes we just turn up and we're just helping people as we go, but if we have a medic space and people come over, it's an obligation to present them with accurate information. If they ask what they should do if tear gas is released, if they ask what they should do if they fall, this is when you give that education. This involves safety procedures, teach people in your community how to protest in a safe-ish, risk-aware fashion. To bring food, to bring water, what kind of clothing, what kind of shoes, how to respond when faced with certain types of force or the threat of those kinds of force. This is one of the biggest ways in which a medic can act as a force of prevention of harm at protests rather than treating it after the fact. Education to create other medics. Most medic collectives and some individual medics spend a non-trivial amount of their time offering training to others in order to have more trained street medics, action medics, riot medics, protest medics, whatever. The idea is that the more trained protest medics there are, the less overworked and the more supported all of them will be. This is education for the sake of the continuation of knowledge, for the sake of recruitment, for the sake of making sure that there are enough medics to support the increasingly large communities of disenfranchised, disillusioned, and oppressed people in our communities. Education for the communities we serve. Some medics and collectives will have this as a primary concern, while others will have it as a tertiary concern. It is the most political, subversive, and in some ways the most important type of education a medic or medic collective can provide. Medic collectives in particular will often provide baseline education to communities that are marginalized, oppressed, and suffering from structural violence in the form of lack of access to medical knowledge, medical professionals, and medical treatment. Often these are the communities that they come from or that they live in. By providing this knowledge, medic collectives are providing a level of built-in resilience to structural violence. We help people have information about accurate sex education, STDs, STIs, sexual consent, pregnancy. We help people have first aid training. We help people have a baseline level of medical knowledge that they otherwise would not have access to, which decreases their dependence on for-profit systems of allopathic medicine that they may distrust, often rightfully so, or simply not have ready access to. In the case of herbalists or other practitioners who are designated non-allopathic and thus non-regulated, we may provide knowledge that will allow those communities to be more medically self-sufficient. Some street medics collectives consider the education to be an inherent part of their treatment role, providing those they help in an acute context with the knowledge to continue their own healing and recovery. I am one of these. I consider education a primary ethical duty of medic collectives. I'm aware that not every collective does this, and I think that they still do good work. You know, they roll out and they support an action and then they all go home. That is still needed. I consider it an ethical obligation for myself to provide education, which is why I'm doing this. Anyway,
Also,
additionally,
that is an old photograph.
oh yeah, our wild crafting classes that we used to teach.
Yeah.
I think this is like a decade ago.
Yeah. Yeah, about that.
Additionally, it is known truth that teaching a subject is an excellent way to learn about it. Focusing on the ethics and values of practice when teaching new medics may reveal areas that can be improved. Instructing others in the known and verified benefits of herbal medicines may force an herbalist to revisit what they consider the necessary standard of evidence before recommending a treatment, or what information they consider it necessary to provide to a client when there is a gap in said evidence. The development of a curriculum forces a specific standard, and if that is done through the lens of an ethical practice, then it enables both the instructors and the students to continuously iterate on the accepted ethical standards of practice and the accepted standard of care. Okay, that's the ethics. Before we get into the legalities, this is a good time to pause for questions. Questions, comments, snark? Yes.
When you said hydrogen peroxide isn't best practices anymore, what is, what are they substituting it for?
So if you have a cut, you're going to want to wash it very thoroughly in just simple soap and water. Then you're going to want to apply something like petroleum jelly to it and bandage it. And then every day, wash it again, reapply petroleum jelly with your very clean hands, put on a fresh bandage. It has been found in clinical studies that both rubbing alcohol and hydrogen peroxide actually damage the cells further and delay healing rather than improve healing. Now, that does not mean that rubbing alcohol doesn't have its place in your first aid kit. It is used to sterilize skin before something like a needle goes into it. It is not used to sterilize a wound after a wound has happened.
Sterilize your tools.
Yeah, it's used to sterilize your tools, used to sterilize the environment. But if someone has like a cut on their arm, that's not where you want rubbing alcohol. Now, there's a debate on rubbing alcohol and puncture wounds, which we'll get into when we get into puncture wounds. There's some contradictory evidence going back and forth. But for something like a cut that you get, you don't want to use rubbing alcohol. Okay. Yes.
When you were talking about respecting someone's bodily autonomy and asking permission before you touch them and attempt to treat them, what if they couldn't give you permission? Like they were,
An exception to this would be if
Unconscious.
someone's unconscious. In which case you're going to restrict the touching of their body to what is absolutely necessary for treating their acute injury, and touch no further than that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Legalities. So before we get into the legalities of street medicine, I just want to touch on legalities of protesting. If you attended our class or it's like a 3-hour seminar on safe-ish protesting, I apologize. This is going to get into some overlapping information. But this is very good for you to know as medics, because a lot of the time you're going to be serving at a protest, so you should know the legalities of the protest itself as well as the legalities of serving as a medic there. Everyone understand why I'm including this? Cool. Although not every action a medic serves at will be a protest, in particular, like right now, what you'd probably be serving at is climate catastrophe, with flooding. Like in our area, that's primarily what people are going to be rolling out for. As many medics will serve at protests at some point. Public protests have played critical and pivotal roles in the history of American social justice. We teach multiple classes on the history of activism, including the history of herbalism as activism and the history of street protest riot action medicine, so I'm not going to belabor this point here. Public protests have, I already read that. It is important to understand the right to protest and both its broad protections and narrow limitations. The government does have the ability to restrict protests under certain circumstances. The First Amendment states Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Although the First Amendment does not explicitly refer to protest, courts have repeatedly held that the First Amendment's protection of free expression encompasses the right to protest through the constitutionally protected rights of free speech, peaceable assembly, and petitioning the government for change. The right to freedom of speech grants protesters the right to express their opinion on public property, including speeches, signs and banners, and symbolic acts. Courts have made exception that this speech and these acts cannot contain true threats, expressing the intent to commit an act of unlawful violence to a particular person or group, and incitement, speech directed at producing imminent lawless action that is likely to produce it. This doesn't mean that a protest can never mention or advocate for violence. Free speech can express philosophical support for violence, general endorsement of it, or even assert a moral propriety or moral necessity for violence. Freedom of speech protects hateful, insulting, and offensive speech as well. The right to peaceable assembly grants protesters the right to gather in groups to protest at demonstrations, rallies, and marches. The right to petition the government means those protests can include requests and demands that the government address injustice or change specific legislation. Recently, threats have been made to withdraw federal funding from any college, school, or university that allows illegal protests. Agitators have also been threatened with imprisonment and deportation without trial. But agitator is not a legal term, and agitation is a form of free speech. There's no such thing as an illegal protest. Law enforcement cannot declare an assembly unlawful without an exceptionally strong reason to do so. The First Amendment prohibits law enforcement from declaring assembly unlawful because of the assembly's message. Any attempt to shut down a protest because of its message would bluntly violate the freedom of speech. Doesn't stop them, they do it all the time anyway, but they are violating people's rights when they do so. So where is speech protected? How much protection a protest has under free speech depends on its location and what type of forum that location is. The Supreme Court has recognized spaces such as sidewalks and parks as areas that have been used immemorially for public expression, and the government's authority to regulate speech in those spaces is sharply circumscribed. Immemorially refers to things that originate in the past or are very old. So this refers to a traditional use. Locations that are not traditionally used for free expression can still be designated as space of public forum and have the same First Amendment protections as those that have been used immemorially. However, any space that is designated as this can lose that designation. But while it has the same protections as speech in a public park or on a sidewalk. There are also limited public forums, which are opened for a particular purpose rather than for all free speech expression. The government can limit expression in a limited public forum to particular groups or topics, such as when a town council allows public comments related to council or town business and policies. So like when Republicans hold a convention, they can say, this is for only Republicans. And then as long as everyone there is expressing things that have to do with Republican policies, that's protected under freedom of speech. But if Democrats come and storm in and they start agitating and protesting, they can be removed because that was only designated for that group. Does that make sense? Okay. The government is not permitted to engage in viewpoint discrimination for establishing a limited public forum, where it attempts to regulate what opinions the speakers can express. The First Amendment protects speech in a limited public forum so long as the protester belongs to the class of people for whom the forum exists, and the focus of their speech is within the topics for which the forum was opened. There are also non-public forums, which are public properties that have not been immemorially used for free speech or designated as open for public expression. Examples include polling places, travel terminals, and military bases. The government cannot restrict all forms of free speech in those areas. For example, it can't prohibit a traveler from expressing an opinion with what their t-shirt says, but they can prohibit large rallies. All restrictions are legally required to be reasonable and viewpoint neutral. On private property, the government has no right to restrict a person's speech on their own property, but grants no protections for the right to protest on someone else's private property without their consent. You can't just go set up at somebody else's house. So are all kinds of protests protected in a traditional public forum? No. There are restrictions and regulations that the government can put in place. There are generally time, place, and manner restrictions. They are only valid if they can be justified without reference to the speech's content. They have to be specific to specific governmental interests, including traffic safety or residential privacy. For example, the government can restrict people from having a march in a residential neighborhood at 3 o'clock in the morning. Any restrictions have to leave open alternative channels for communication of that same idea, such as acting that the protest take place during the day. There are legal arguments to be made that any restriction requiring that free speech in a public forum be restricted by time, place, and manner is not constitutional, but courts so far have found that these restrictions are acceptable and you will be arrested if you violate them. So keep that in mind. Do you need a permit? The answer is sometimes. For large protests that require street closures or take over a public park, the government can require notifications or permits, but any requirements have to be based on the government's actual needs and have clear, objective, and content-neutral standards. The government cannot treat protests differently based on the views that they are individually expressing. The notice period cannot be excessively long and must allow for spontaneous protest in response to recent news and events. Marches on the sidewalks generally don't require permits, so long as marchers do not obstruct car or pedestrian traffic. However, if the march requires blocking traffic or a street closure, if it is going to gather at a park or a plaza and take over a lot of it, if it requires the use of sound amplifying devices, then a permit may be needed. The route of a march cannot be restricted unless it is necessary for traffic or public safety, and if the protest cannot afford to pay the fee for the permit, they should allow a waiver for those who cannot afford it. Courts have found that requiring individuals or small groups to apply for notice or permit was unconstitutional, so long as the protest is in a traditional public forum. Why to maybe not get a permit? In recent months, some protest groups have obtained permits from the NYPD, for example, for demonstrations. Here are some reasons why obtaining permission and permits from the police for protests might be counterproductive or even dangerous. Requiring permits at all violates our First Amendment rights, and we ideally should not be complicit in that violation. Requesting permission from the apparatus of oppression to protest that oppression is kind of counterintuitive. Protests are meant to be disruptive, and disruptive protests are more effective. Working with the government and or the police doesn't disrupt the current system, it legitimizes it. Permitted routes and locations are restricted routes and locations. They stifle the ability of the protest to be flexible and to grow. When police know the route and the location of every part of a protest, it is easier for them to set up counter weapons and surveillance technology, block access, and kettle the protesters. If they know the route that you are taking, they can and will set up things that take pictures of every license plate that goes in there, pictures of the faces of the people who are driving. They will set up things that keep track of every phone of every protester. Sometimes it's better for them not to know. Permits may create unsafe environments for undocumented people as law enforcement cooperates with ICE. Cops can lie to protest organizers and protesters. It is common and a completely incorrect belief that cops cannot lie to you. They absolutely can. They can promise one thing and do something else. Permits do not make protesters safer. Even permitted protests have been targeted by police action, where police have arrested protesters, destroyed protest equipment and medic supplies, and brutalized the protesters. Some groups getting permits while others don't make pit groups against each other, with some being portrayed in the media as good and others as bad. Those who are perceived as bad for not being complicit in the limiting of their own human rights may be targets for more injustice that will be further excused because, well, why didn't they just pull a permit and abide by the rules? Permitted protests have to be linked to a person's legal identity, which does not work for anonymized protests and makes it very easy for organizers to be doxxed. Young decided to test this at one point to see how long it would take him to find out who pulled a permit for a 50501 protest and how much information he could find out about that person. It took him about 5 minutes to know their home address and where they worked. And that's with his resources as an independent citizen, not a cop. So, and if he can find it, the Proud Boys can find it. The neo-Nazis can find it. The counter-protesters can find it. So keep that in mind. What about counter-protesters? On one hand, the government cannot use the expected reaction of other people as a justification to restrict a protest. But it also cannot restrict counter-protesters from expressing their own free speech either. They have just as much right to protest your protest as you do to protest in the first place. Unfortunately, the government can require protesters to pay for insurance to cover damages to public property. However, the government can't place an undue burden on the protesters, and they have to reflect the actual costs and risks based on things like crowd sizes. They are not legally allowed to base the price of the insurance they ask you to get if you do pull a permit on the protest message or the fact that counter-protesters might show up. They'll try sometimes. We had a city try and say you have to pay a larger insurance fee because you're going to get a lot of counter-protesters. They're not legally allowed to do that. Anyway, the government can also enforce laws against violence, such as fighting with counter-protesters, as well as those against other crimes like vandalism, destruction of public property. Additionally, protesters have the right to destroy their own property, but not the property of counter-protesters. For example, a protester can burn a flag that they are carrying anywhere where fire is permitted, but they cannot take the flags of the counter-protesters and burn them. So you can't take away their Trump flag or their Nazi flag or whatever and burn it, but you can burn your own flag if you want to.
Well,
Okay.
you can.
Well, you can, but you might be arrested for it. Legalities of street medicine in particular. Street medics, riot medics, action medics, protest medics, whatever you want to call them, fall into a strange state of legal exception. Most have no medical license and would not normally be legally allowed to treat a person in medical crisis. In emergencies, special laws go into effect referred to as Good Samaritan laws. In those cases of emergency, licensed physicians often can't provide services on the street without special permission from the governing authorities, or they are at risk of losing their license. Although some doctors and nurses operate as street riot and action medics, either outside the bounds of the law or with special permission granted to them by the authorities, most street riot and action medics are not physicians or nurses. Rather, they have had more specific training, such as wilderness first responder training, first aid training, or this kind of training that is specifically to create action medics. The UN Convention for the Amelioration of the Condition of the Wounded and Sick in Armed Forces in the Field requires that there be mutual consent of both sides before medics can serve. However, it's unclear if the zone of no protest, in which activist protest qualifies as an armed conflict, or what laws remain to protect them. There have been a lot of court debates over this. Right now, we're basically covered by you can show up as long as the protesters don't ask you to leave. Anyway, there are legal rules for what a Good Samaritan can and cannot do for those harmed in emergencies, although they vary from state to state. The laws offer protection only for people who have no duty to act. It's not part of your paid job description to provide the care that you're providing. A medic must not assist someone without their consent, then being unconscious is the exception for this, and if they wake up and say, "Get off me, leave me alone," then back off, leave them alone. A medic must not operate outside the bounds of their competence. If they're not trained for CPR, they can't provide CPR. If they are not trained, or if they are trained as like a wilderness first responder, they can provide the level of care that a wilderness first responder would naturally provide. They have to be held to the standard of care that they are trained to. The care provided must be free. So this is both an ethical requirement and a legal requirement. Of the two, I consider ethical more important, but it is also part of the legal protection under which you operate. The specifics of the laws vary from state to state. The Good Samaritan laws do not cover an action, a street, or protest or riot medic who gives someone an over-the-counter drug like aspirin, Advil, ibuprofen, Tylenol, dispense a prescription drug. So an example of this is you can dig a person's inhaler out for them, like if they say, it's in my bag, and hand it to them, but you cannot give it to them. Like you can't actually depress it for them and administer it to them. Now if someone is choking in front of you, you get to decide what legal things you're gonna stick to. But you can't inject someone with their insulin, for example. Everyone clear? Okay. Commit gross negligence, willful harm, or abandonment. Yes?
What about EpiPens?
Yeah, so technically, legally, we're not allowed to.
So interesting.
Right, but it's one of the things that's like, okay, well, I'd rather be sued than have them die.
Yes.
Like, I'd rather be arrested than have them die. So this is one of those times where I'm just going to admit on camera in something that's going to end up getting posted online. I've absolutely broken these laws. Because what matters to me is the ethics, not the legalities. However, I feel like you need to know what you're legally covered for and what you're not. So like some people, when they set up a medic tent, they have a table that has like ibuprofen, Tylenol, those kind of things. And if someone comes in, it's like, yes, those supplies are in the tent. But you can't say, here's 4 of them. Take these. So that's one way that people get around this. But for something like an EpiPen, yeah, I've administered an EpiPen to someone. I'm not just going to sit there and watch them have anaphylactic shock in front of me and not help. I actually think that the legal restrictions are kind of mind-boggling and strange, because where's the line? So I'm allowed to use a tourniquet, but I can't help someone get their inhaler into their mouth if they're shaking? Why? Who determined this? This is ridiculous. But it's the legal standard. Anyway. Okay. Did that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. The Supreme Court of California recently allowed civil suits to continue against volunteer aid providers, so a Good Samaritan may still be sued, even if they acted to save someone's life. If a licensed medical professional does provide services as a Riot Street protest action medic, when legally permitted to do so, they are legally required to still follow HIPAA. So any records generated must stay with the person who has been assisted. Even if a person has extensive wilderness first responder training or first aid training, it is my personal recommendation that they still attend medic training courses, and that with their first few outings, they operate under the auspices of a medic collective. We operate under unique emergency environments, and I think that they require specialized training. Okay. Legalities of herbalism for activism.
It's terrifying.
There are currently no licensing requirements or required certifications for herbalists in any state of the United States that preclude the rights of anyone to use, dispense, or recommend plant-based medicines. Anybody can call themselves an herbalist. Anybody. There's absolutely no standard that you're held to identify as an herbalist. So anyone can just be like, yeah, I paid the $100 to have a business license. I attended, a 3-hour class, or I've watched a lot of YouTube videos, or I've read some books, and I now consider myself an herbalist, and I'm just going to start selling herbal products online. Anybody can do that, and a lot of people are, who have absolutely inadequate training, and they're killing people. They are absolutely killing people. Some states, including California, have restrictions that apply to naturopathic physicians and acupuncturists and their use of natural remedies in the scope of their practice. But there is no state licensing for herbalists other than that which is linked to a specific profession, and that's only in certain states, California and Louisiana, actually. Herbalists can choose to register with the American Herbalist Guild and demonstrate their core knowledge and competency by meeting the standard of the AHG, but this is not a legally required standard. Additionally, the AHD has currently put their testing and registration on hold because they're reviewing and updating the entire process, including the standard that they're testing to. Some herbalists may also choose to pursue a diploma in Chinese herbology, which does require a certification by the National Certification Commission of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine. You are not allowed to say that you are a practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine without that certificate. Like, legally, you can't operate as one. And they will potentially come after you if you decide to. Herbalists cannot claim to diagnose, prescribe, treat, or claim to cure diseases. To avoid practicing medicine without a license, herbalists should be familiar with the language that could not be construed as violating those restrictions. Additionally, they cannot claim that any product they make can treat or cure a disease, as this would violate FDA and FTC regulations. Herbalists are still required to comply with good manufacturing practices of the FDA, and all labeling and advertisement has to follow FDA and FTC regulations. Some states restrict herbalists from referring to their business as an apothecary, a pharmacy, or a medicine shop. Herbalists need to check the law for the state that they are in before setting up a business. In North Carolina specifically, one of our general statutes in Chapter 90, Medicine and Allied Occupations, has a statute for unlawful practice of pharmacy, which prohibits herbalists from using the term apothecary for their business unless they are licensed and registered to practice pharmacy in North Carolina. So you are not allowed to set up a business and be like, this is an herbal pharmacy. When herbalists teach a class, write an article or a book, lead an herb walk, etc., if they are not associating the talk with a product line, or brand, and not providing direct services to a client, they can talk about the historical medicinal use of herbs more freely. However, they still need to avoid providing direct health recommendations to any students in the class. So this is how I actually teach my classes on herbalism for AFAB autonomy. It goes into like abortifacient herbs, is that I present the information as preserving historical wisdom, preserving traditional knowledge. I cannot legally say, and you should go take this for this issue because it will take care of it. I can say, well, historically, these people used this much of it to do this. Okay? All right. That is everything I wanted to cover from our notes today. Does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns while we're still recording? Keeping in mind that I'm going to turn off the recording and ask again if you don't want your question to be recorded.